Hello. In this video, I want to give a brief overview of the dative case in Latin, how to recognize it, what it is, and what it does. I may in due course re-edit this video and join it to a whole series in which I discuss all of the Latin cases. For the moment, I'm making it to address a specific need of some of my early learners in the language. Although what I say goes beyond the immediate needs of an early learner, I hope even so that it will be useful to my early learners, and I hope it will be useful to those who are perhaps not quite early learners. Here, let me emphasize my reason for making this video. If you are not able to recognize the dative case, or not able to understand how it is used, your progress in Latin will come to a sudden and perhaps a final stop. If you do know the dative, you'll have no trouble with the genitive and ablative. Indeed, you will have no further trouble, in principle, with learning Latin as a whole. Therefore, and here's a phrase I will use several times in this video, a full understanding of the dative case is of critical importance. You cannot make solid progress in Latin until you've mastered it. Therefore, this video. Let me begin with a discussion of what can be called the easy part of the language. As soon as you start learning it, you will learn that Latin is an inflected language, or that things which we do in English with prepositions and word order we do in Latin by changing the endings of words. If your introduction to the language is handled properly, you will find at the very beginning that it doesn't seem to be a very difficult language after all. One of the first things you'll learn, or one of the first things you should learn when studying Latin, is how subjects and objects are treated, both in English and in Latin. And I'll begin in English with my favourite introductory examples. Look at these two sentences. The slave kills the wolf kills the slave. These are very different sentences. They have very different meanings, and if you are the slave, or indeed if you are the wolf, it is a matter of critical importance. Second use here of the phrase, which word in these sentences comes before the verb? The reason for that is that in an English sentence, generally speaking, the subject comes before the verb. Here I should define some of my terms. The subject is the person or thing in a sentence that does the action of the verb. Look again at these two sentences. In the first, it is the slave who is the subject because the slave comes before the verb. In the second, it's the wolf who is the subject. Again, the wolf comes before the verb. Keep looking at the sentences. In the first, you can see that the wolf is the object. Another definition here. The object is the person or thing in the sentence that is having the action of the verb done to it. The slave kills the wolf, and the wolf kills the slave. Poor slave, perhaps poor wolf. Once you are aware of the distinction between subject and object in English, it's pretty easy to see how this kind of sentence is handled in Latin. Here are the same sentences in Latin. Servus lupum necat. Servum lupus necat. You can see that although the order of the words doesn't change, the endings change. In these sentences, I've put us in red to mark that these are subjects, and I've put the endings in a kind of yellow to mark that these are the objects. Once you have this clear, you go on to learn that most Latin nouns, possibly 98% of them, though this isn't something I've ever counted, fall into one of three groups, and we call these groups declensions. And here we have these three declensions on a table. The subject in Latin is called the nominative, though I do hope you know that, and the object is called the accusative, and again, I hope that you know that, but I put them here just for the avoidance of doubt. You will know, and I hope you've known for some time, that Latin nouns behave rather like Latin verbs. By this, I mean that they comprise a root, which does not change, or which doesn't change very often, and a set of endings that are added to this root. Here on the table, I've given the roots in white, and I've given the endings. We call them the case endings. I've given those in red. As I've said, there are three main declensions. There are two others, but we will ignore those for the moment. There is the first, which is mostly feminine. There is the second, which is largely masculine. And although there is a neuter gender in Latin, that is not important for this video, so I won't take it into account. Indeed, I'm not dealing explicitly with masculine and feminine at all. I'm simply dealing with these three declensions. Yes, forget discussion of gender. We are looking at three groups or three declensions of noun. Coming back to our main thread, you have the first declension where the nominative singular ends in A and the accusative in AM, and the plural endings are AE and AS. You have ancilla, ancillam, ancilli, ancillas. You have the second declension, and these US endings are not universal to that declension, but again, this is something that we'll overlook for the moment, since we're dealing here with the dative case, not with the case system as a whole. So for present purposes, just take it that the nominative, or the subject of a second declension noun, ends US in the singular, and that the accusative case ends with UM, and then in the plural it ends with I and with OS. So you have servus, servum, servi, servos. For the third declension, I'll use mercator, or merchant. Here we have mercator, mercatorem, mercatores, mercatores. If you haven't so far learned these six endings, I do advise you to learn them at once, and to learn them so thoroughly that they're burned into your memory. There are other endings that need to be learned, and I'm about to reveal one of these to you. You must learn these as well, and you must learn all the others that I've not revealed and will not reveal in this video, regardless of whether I mention them. All these case endings must be learned. You really cannot tell yourself, I won't learn these, instead I'll just let them soak in. Oh, that may work, but it probably won't, not for a while at least, and it will save a lot of time and trouble if at the beginning of your course of learning you sit down and learn at least these six basic endings. Though this is a video about the dative case, not the cases in general, I think it's worth at least mentioning the third declension nominative singulars. Unlike the other two declensions, these have a variety of endings. Here are some examples. Mercator, in the accusative mercatorem, grumio becomes grumionem, senex, senem, civis, civem. I mention this variety of endings because once you've learned a reasonable number of words from each declension, you can use your knowledge of the relevant case endings to understand and even to make up simple statements in Latin. Have a look at these, and I've taken or adapted these examples and other examples in this video from Book 1 of the Cambridge Latin course, Yes, have a look at these. Amicus Caecilium visitat. A friend is visiting Caecilius. Ancilla grumionem delectat. The slave girl pleases Grumio. Mercator pecuniam capit. The merchant takes the money. Yes, you need to learn the nominative and accusative singular and plural for each of these three declensions. But having done this, you can read and you can make up simple statements in Latin. Do not, however, tell yourself, "Oh, this isn't such a difficult language as I thought it might be." The problem is that this is not the whole of the Latin case system. There are 4 other cases, and here is one of them. This is the dative case, and here is where the trouble often starts. You begin with an airy assurance from your teacher that this means 2 or 4 something. This is an assurance I give all my students. Sometimes they nod and get on with learning it. They take what I say on trust. They learn the dative, and it causes no great difficulty. But sometimes, indeed perhaps often, it doesn't go in. And it's then that I have to start earning my keep as a teacher. Let me repeat what I said at the start of this video. If you can make full sense of the dative case, you will have no trouble with the other cases, and you are on the way to a good knowledge of Latin. If you don't make full sense of the dative case, any further learning you do in Latin will be like a house built on sand. It is that important. Now, a number of questions arise over this dative case. The first is, what is it? The second is, why is it needed? And the third, and this perhaps is the one that strikes most students immediately, is why all the duplicates? I will answer these questions, though I won't give answers of equal length to them. I'll begin with the last. Why all the duplicates? And look at the duplicates. Look at the first declension. Look at the singular dative ancillae. Still in the first declension, look at the plural nominative ancillae. Look at them, I've made them both big so they jump out at you. They're both the same. Presumably they both do different things. They must do different things. One is singular, one is plural. Never mind the particular function. But why do they have the same endings, and how do you tell them apart in practice? Or look at the second declension. Look at the nominative plural servi. There it is, that's jumping out as well. Look now at the third declension and go down to the dative case. There it is again, I'm making it jump out for you. The singular dative mercatori. Both end with I. Again, one is singular and one is plural. Presumably again, they both do different things, but they do look exactly the same. Indeed, looking at the endings, they are exactly the same. So why do you have these duplicates, and how do you tell them apart? I could give you a very long-winded answer to that question, or I could give you a very long-winded answer to the question of why we have the duplicates. And I suppose some kind of answer to that question will be useful. I'll explain the use of the answer in a moment. Yes, let's give the answer. Why the duplicates? And the answer is that throughout its entire history as a spoken language, Latin was in a continual state of change. A state of change from the hyper-complexity of the ancient Indo-European language that is its ancestor, towards the comparative simplicity of the modern Romance languages that are its daughters, languages like French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, and so on. something that happened in Latin between about 200 BC and about 400 AD, or during about a 600-year period, was a gradual shrivelling away of the case system. For whatever reason in their spoken language, the Romans, and then Latin speakers in general, began to realise that these elaborate case endings were not actually necessary for being understood. They gradually found, and the emphasis here is on gradually because it took over 1,000 years to be completed, but they gradually realised that they could get by with something a bit like the system that we use in English, or that is used in modern French and Italian and the other daughter languages. And this is to have a reasonably fixed order of words and then to use prepositions to deal with any possible ambiguities. And because the case system was beginning to shrivel away, an increasing number of these endings were no longer distinguished. There were no longer any differences between them. And if they were redundant or tending towards redundancy, why bother maintaining so many different endings? The problem for us when we learn Latin as a foreign language is that the grammar we must learn is a snapshot of this transformation. The grammar of classical Latin, or the grammar of the written language, is the grammar of the language as it was broadly spoken by the Roman upper classes in the century or so before the birth of Christ. This was the Latin written by a series of very great Roman authors, men like Lucretius, Cicero, Catullus, Livy, Virgil, and so forth. Though the spoken language continued to change thereafter, the written language was now set in concrete and has barely changed since. Therefore, it's a bit of a mess. When you learn the ablative case, for example, you will see that this is largely meaningless without prepositions to make it clear what is being said. For the same reason, there are duplicated forms for both verbs and nouns. Therefore, the duplicated endings I have just shown. This was no problem for the Romans. They learned the spoken language as babies and the written language as young children. Native speakers can put up with any degree of irregularity. They can put up with any degree of chaos in their language. They barely even notice it. For us as outsiders, it's a nuisance. And there, in the least long-winded way that I can manage, is my explanation of these duplicates. Oh, I accept that explaining their reason doesn't in itself take away difficulties. Even so, it can, and perhaps it will, let you live more comfortably with them. If, however, you want to minimize the difficulties, here are 3 solutions. First, you must learn the endings for each of these declensions. You must memorize their endings. You must be able to reel them off from memory, ankilla, ankillam, ankillai, and so forth. You must learn these, and you must learn all the other endings as and when these may be revealed to you. Do not, I beg you again, say to yourself, I don't need to learn these endings. What I can do is guess them as and when I see them. You can't do that. It's not possible. Learn the endings. My second piece of advice, and this follows from what I've just said, is whenever you learn a new noun, you must also learn into which of the 3 main declensions this noun falls. If you don't do this, you will be confronted by words like mercatori. Look at it in the table on the left. This is the dative singular of a 3rd declension noun. But if you don't know that mercator is a 3rd declension noun, you may find yourself under the fatally mistaken assumption that mercatori is the nominative plural of a second declension noun. If you make that assumption, you will almost certainly not be able to translate the sentence in which you find that word. It is even possible, if you're sitting in examination and doing an unseen translation, that you'll mess up the entire translation because you have mistaken the case of a single word. So, when you learn a new noun in Latin, say mercator, do not simply look in your dictionary and find mercator and find that it means merchant and then slam your dictionary shut. If you do that, you've only learned half of the meaning. What you must learn is that mercator means merchant and that mercator is a third declension noun. This being done, when you see mercatori, you will know at once that it means to or for the merchant and not the merchants. My last piece of advice is to be aware of context. Context makes everything clear so long as you know when and where to look for it. Look at this sentence. Feminae tabernam intrant. A little while ago, I had a student translate this as, the shop goes inside the woman. It doesn't mean that. It can't mean that. Oh, I grant that feminae is a dative singular first declension noun and also a nominative plural first declension noun. Seen as a word only in itself, it's impossible to decide which of those it is. But look again at the sentence. Tabernam is an accusative case. Intrant ends with nt, so it's a plural verb. More than one person is going inside the shop, therefore feminae is nominative. It must be nominative plural of the first declension. It can't be anything else. Think about that. Context is king. Let me come back, though, to the three questions I put earlier. What is the dative case? Why is it needed? Why the duplicates? I've answered this last question. As for why it's needed, I suppose the best answer to that is because it is part of the language, and that is how things are done. Very often, the best answer to why in a language is because. Here, though, the dative isn't actually necessary. Have a look at these two sentences. Dixi ancillae, dixi ad ancillam. These both mean, I spoke to the slave girl. Look at the first sentence and look at the table on the left to see that I've not made a mistake. Ancillae is a singular dative case. This is correct usage, or correct usage according to the rules of the classical language, but this isn't necessarily how the Romans spoke to each other. At some time in the history of Latin as a spoken language, probably after about 300 AD, the dative case disappeared or began to disappear from the spoken language. By the time you get to St. Jerome's translation of the Bible into Latin in 405 AD, you get constructions of the second kind, a preposition plus the accusative. I could say that this shows the disappearance of the dative. I have just said that, but it may just show an alternative which was frowned on in the written language. You do see this construction much earlier than 405. Indeed, in Greek, which has similar grammatical rules to Latin, even in the High Classical period of the 5th century BC, you will see these constructions in use side by side. But to answer the question I've set, why the dative? It's needed because it's there. It may not need to be there, but it is there. So just get on with learning it. Now to the main question, what are the functions of the dative case? To answer this question, let me move for a while to a discussion of how English works. Wherever possible, when you're learning a new language, you should try to understand the workings of this foreign language by thinking how we do similar things in our own language. This may not work particularly well for all languages, but my experience is that where the ancient Indo-European languages are concerned, it does work rather well. It works in Latin, it works in Greek, and although English, Greek and Latin are on the surface rather different languages, they're all descended from Proto-Indo-European. Below the superficial differences of vocabulary, they do tend to work in similar ways. So let's have a look in English at the distinction between direct and indirect objects. We'll start with this sentence: I gave a book to the boy. In this sentence, you have a subject, I. You have a verb, gave. You have two objects. You have book and you have boy. You will see, without any particular analysis, that the object that follows directly from the verb is book. It is a book that I gave. Book is very closely connected to gave. Boy, on the other hand, is another object, but it doesn't link directly to the verb. It doesn't hang directly from gave. I gave a book to the boy. I didn't give the boy to anybody. I just gave a book to the boy. There is a connection between the verb gave and the object boy, but this connection runs through the other object book. So, I gave a book to the boy. From this, we can say that in this sentence, book is the direct object. It is the one that is immediately connected to the verb. Boy, on the other hand, is an indirect object of the verb. Or we can say that the direct object is something the verb directly touches, and the indirect object is something the verb can only get at through the direct object. In English, you can see, we show indirect objects by word order and by using prepositions. I gave a book to the boy. And that's how we show direct and indirect objects in English. There is the same distinction in Latin between direct and indirect objects, but this is a distinction shown not by word order or prepositions. It's shown in Latin, for whatever reason, by using the dative case for the indirect object. Let's illustrate this by taking the sentence, I gave a book to the boy. Let's break it up and place it a word at a time, each in its own column in an invisible table. Here it is. I gave a book to the boy. Let's then do some parsing. That is, let's do some grammatical analysis of the sentence. I is the subject. Gave is the verb. A is an article. Book is the direct object of the verb. To is a preposition. The is another article. Boy is the indirect object. Let's see how this is done in Latin by matching up the words in the table according to their functions. Librum dedi puero. Notice that you don't need so many words in Latin as you do in English. You don't need to specify the subject I, because that's already shown by the verb dedi. Dedi is a first-person singular perfect tense. For this reason, the subject ego is already contained in the verb. Unless you need a particular emphasis to show that I am the person who gave the book, you don't need to bother with ego. Librum is a second declension accusative. It's a singular second declension accusative. Again, if you doubt me, check it on the table. I'm keeping it there partly so you can check these things if I go wrong. It is the direct object of the verb dedi. And of course Latin doesn't bother with articles, so we don't use a. Then you have the indirect object, puero, which again you can check out yourself on the table. Puero is a singular dative in the second declension. I gave a book to the boy in English, dedi librum puero in Latin. And this is one of the main uses of the dative case. The indirect object is shown in Latin by using the dative case. Having explained it as well as I presently can, I will reinforce this point with a few examples. Again, examples taken or adapted from Book 1 of the Cambridge Latin course. Before I do this, though, I'll make a few changes. First, I will adapt the cases to make it clear that direct objects are shown by the accusative case and indirect objects by the dative case. I've done that. Then I will move my past sentences over here on the left so that they're out of the way, but so that you can still see them. Here are the examples. Metella filio togam quaerebat. Metella was seeking a toga for her son. Servi feminis stolas ostendebant. Slaves were showing dresses to the women. Servi gladiatoribus tunicas ostendebant. Slaves were showing tunics to the gladiators. Mercator servis signum dedit. The merchant gave a sign to his slaves. Tibi triginta denarius offero. I offer you 30 denarii, or I offer 30 denarii to you. Melissa mercatori pecuniam dedit. Melissa gave the money to the merchant. Let's move now to another use of the dative case. There are some verbs that take the dative as their direct object. This appears to be a legacy of Proto-Indo-European. Greek has many more verbs that take a dative direct object, and many that take a genitive direct object. Latin is more sparing in what we may regard as a grammatical wrinkle. I'll give 6 of the verbs that you need for GCSE Latin that take a dative object. These shouldn't be alarming. You really do need to know these. Again, if you don't, you'll mess up any translation that involves such a verb. So when you learn a verb, for example, appropinquo, you don't learn just that it means I approach. You also learn that it goes with the dative. This use of the dative as a direct object will be less trouble than it may seem in the abstract. All of these 6 verbs can credibly be fitted into a similar English structure. Here they are. Appropinquo, already used that, I approach. And you can translate that into English, just about I suppose, as I come near to something. Credo. I believe in this. I trust in that. Favio. I favour. I give favour to someone. Impero. I order. And you can turn that into I give an order to someone. Persuadio. I persuade. I apply persuasion to someone. Resisto, I resist. I put up resistance to someone. Yes, it may not look entirely natural, it may look rather clumsy, but it is credible to turn these verbs in Latin, which take a dative object, into verbs in English that take a dative object. I come finally to indirect constructions with the dative. This isn't something that I offer to the new learners for whom I began this video, but it follows from what I've said, so I will continue. First, I should define indirect construction. An indirect construction is a sentence of which the subject is it. As ever, here are some English examples of indirect construction. It is raining. It is cold. It is boring. And have a look at this one. It is necessary for Anthony to drink water. This last, it is necessary for Anthony to drink water, is a very clumsy construction in English, and whenever you see a sentence like this, you can be sure that someone has been learning Latin or is imitating someone else who has been learning Latin. This last type of construction doesn't work well in English and is generally to be avoided. However, it is a fair reflection of how things are done in Latin. Let's then have a closer look at the sentence, it is necessary for Anthony to drink water. The subject is it. The person affected by the verb is Anthony, and notice that he is an indirect object. It is necessary for Anthony. In English, you put for in front of it to show that it's an indirect object. To show that he is an indirect object in Latin, of course, you use the dative case, but I'll come to that. The action referenced by the verb is the infinitive to drink, and depending from this infinitive is the further object water. There it is. It is necessary for Anthony to drink water. Let's see how this works in Latin. Necessa est Antonio aquam bibere. Necessa est. It is necessary. That is an impersonal verb. Notice that Antonio is in the dative. Antonius becomes Antonio. If you look at the table on the left, hunt for anything ending in O, and you'll find a singular dative in the second declension. Antonius is a second declension, so necessa est Antonio aquam bibere. It is necessary for Anthony to drink water. Here are some further examples of these indirect constructions. There are other kinds that don't take the dative, but here are some that do take the dative. Dicere puellae libet. The closest I can get to a literal meaning for this is, it is desirous for the girl to speak, and that is a terrible mouthful. It's a terrible mouthful in English, and it borders on the incomprehensible. All I'll say in its defence is that you shouldn't judge Latin syntax from how it looks in English. You should judge it from how it looks in Latin. And this mouthful utterance in English is reduced in Latin to 3 words. Dicere puellae libet. But however it is in Latin, you need to rewrite that sentence in English into something like, the girl wishes to speak. So you turn girl from an indirect object into the subject of the sentence, and everything else follows from that. Exire grumioni licet. It is allowed for Grumio to go out. Unlike the first, this sentence doesn't come close to the incomprehensible, but it is clumsy, and I hope you can see why the term Latinate is so often derogatory. It describes a kind of English that might as well be dead. Once more, you translate this by taking Grumio out of the dative case and putting him back in as the subject. Grumio may go out, or Grumio can go out, or Grumio is allowed to go out. And a last example, cantare servis placent. It is pleasing for the slaves to sing. This does just about work in English, but it doesn't work very well, and so once again you take servis out of the dative plural and you make it into the subject of a new English sentence, something which represents the same meaning as the Latin but does so in a different way. Try, the slaves like singing. And that is it. There is more I can say about the dative. Perhaps there's more I should say about the dative, but this will do as a brief overview, and that's all I promised at the beginning of this video. So this will do as a brief overview to what the dative is and what the dative does. I'll finish by repeating the 3 points I made earlier. In order to avoid difficulty with the dative case, you must do these 3 things. You must learn the endings for each declension. You can't avoid this. Even if rote learning of tables is seriously out of fashion, and even if it was never that effective, it does remain for certain things, and particularly for the endings of the nouns and verbs, something of high and permanent value. So do learn the endings of the nouns for each declension. Second, learn into which declension each noun falls. You must get into the habit of doing this. It will save you a lot of trouble later on. It will save a fair bit in the present. Third, be aware of context. Quite often, you won't, at first glance, be able to tell if ancilli is a singular dative or a nominative plural. You'll get this by looking at the sentence in itself, or, in some cases, you'll get it by looking at the surrounding material. I think, however, I've now said enough. Therefore, I will thank you for having watched this video. I hope you will find time to watch my other videos on Latin, and when I have got round to making them, to watch my videos on Greek. Thank you, and for the moment, goodbye.